This is chapter 35, section 4, that contains 3 pieces of reading from the textbook. The first you see on this slide here is Japan's high tide at Midway. Then we will look at America leapfrogging towards Tokyo. And then the last piece will be the Allied halting of Hitler for chapter 35, section 4. So first, starting with Japan's high tide at Midway, we last left off discussing Japan's initial successes following the attack on Pearl Harbor and how their push in the Far East was overwhelmingly successful. That continued as they pushed southward, invading and conquering and gaining control of New Guinea, Australia, and the Solomon Islands. And this is just a series of basically 9-10 months of victories for the Japanese in the Pacific against the Allies, primarily the United States. However, the Battle of the Midway marks a turning point. It's named Midway for its location in the Pacific Ocean, but its name is indicative of its impact on the fight in the Pacific as well. This is one of those tentpole battles, tentpole meaning it's kind of a turning point, it's a big deal, because the Battle of Midway marks the first time that the United States is able to turn back the Japanese and prevent the Japanese from taking over. And at the Battle of Midway, all the fighting was done by carrier-based aircraft. So like when you see planes taking off of a ship, that is how the fighting was done. And so neither side directly shot at one another in this fight. Pieces of this fight that are worth knowing: Admiral Chester Nimitz, that you see there, was the leader of this fight, and I believe we'll see him in a video at some point. And also use of American technology. The Hellcat fighter plane led to some degree of U.S. successes at the Battle of Midway. But at the Battle of Midway is where the United States stops the Japanese advances and then starts to have some successes on its own, which leads us into the next section that is titled in your textbook, American Leapfrogging Toward Tokyo. And so Admiral Nimitz is the one skillfully coordinating this attack in the Pacific of naval, air, and ground troops. And as we just talked about, the Hellcat fighter plane played a big role, and it destroyed 250 Japanese aircraft while only losing 29 American planes. And I am not a military or weapons historian, but from my understanding, the Hellcat fighter plane was smaller and much more nimble. It was able to turn faster and just move faster in the air, which led to it being successful against the Japanese. And so the United States starts reclaiming territories that were controlled by the Japanese. In your textbook on page 834, it shows what this leapfrog strategy looks like. It is not the United States taking back every territory that the Japanese had gained control of. Instead, it was picking and choosing lightly fortified areas and then attacking those, getting control of those, and then bombing surrounding areas where the Japanese posed a threat. And so the general strategy was to leapfrog towards the Japanese home islands. The Japanese home islands are just where Japan is. And so this was an effective and successful strategy for the Americans in the Pacific. And so by November of 1944, so we're almost 3 months after Pearl Harbor, the Allies are in a position to begin round-the-clock bombing of the Japanese home islands. Shifting our focus from the war in the Pacific back to the war in Europe, this third section, the Allied halting of Hitler. We've not talked much about the war in Europe after the attack on Pearl Harbor, but very similar circumstances had played out in the Atlantic, with Hitler having enormous victories against the U.S. Navy. in the Atlantic Ocean. So Hitler had a formidable fleet of submarines in the Atlantic Ocean, and so at first gaining the upper hand for the United States was extremely difficult, but with the aid of espionage in the form of British code breakers, they were able to break Germany's Enigma codes and essentially then track where the U-boats were lurking in the North Atlantic, which obviously then made it much more easier to attack them. Other victories took place for the Allies, specifically the victories in the Land-Air War was in 1942, as British and American air forces were cascading bombs on German cities. And so this is an indication that not only is Germany being pushed back, we're actually able to inflict damage on the home country of Germany. In October of 1942, you've got a British general leading a victory in El Alamein, right outside of Cairo and near the vital Suez Canal that would make trade more difficult, or the acquisition of materials for Germany more difficult, and Germany and Italy. And so these successes gave a boost in morale, specifically to the Soviet Union, who had been basically Germany's punching bag since Hitler had turned his back on Stalin and attacked them. And so in November of 1942, the Russians were able to launch a counteroffensive to Hitler. The Soviet winter is partially what stopped the Germans from gaining control of the entirety of the Soviet Union. And so this counteroffensive begins in November of 42, and by about a year later, the Soviet Union had regained about 2/3 of the land that had been claimed by the Germans. And so that is where we leave off with chapter 35, section 4.